So these are the seeds of my volunteer squash that grew in the garden this year, and I've saved a few of them to try to grow next year. Now all I do for saving seeds in the garden is I spread them on a piece of kitchen paper towel and leave them in a shaded but warm place and let them dry naturally. I think sometimes if you put seeds in direct sunlight to dry out, they might dry quicker, but they probably lose some of their viability. So it's better if they dry in a just airy and shady place. And most of them are okay. There are a few little bits of the kind of pith to pick off and get rid of. And there are also going to be some seeds in here that aren't worth saving. So, pardon the dog barking in the background. So there's one where the seed coat is damaged, probably when I cut the thing open. Not worth saving, that one. And there's one that's all withered and doesn't really have much inside of it. Again, not worth saving, that one. So I could just put these in a paper envelope, but for seed packets I like to make my own. So here's how I do that. This is kind of an episode of tips you never asked for, in fact. So I've just got a sheet of paper here, sheet of A4 paper here, and I've printed a design in the middle of one side. Volunteer squash. This is the volunteer squash emoji from the Discord server. So custom emoji based on volunteer squash. How about that? If you don't already know about the Atomic Shrimp Discord server, there's a link in the video description. Anyway, so what I'm going to do here is I fold it lengthways like this. I fold about 1/3 into the middle. I fold about the other third into the middle like that. And then I just open that bit up there and tuck that end in. And then the first layer here is now a completely enclosed space. And so my cleaned and sorted seeds can just drop into there. Now I find this preferable to a plastic bag. A plastic bag can encourage condensation and the seeds may not preserve very well in there. A paper envelope or paper container like this just allows the seeds to maintain equilibrium with the atmosphere and to breathe, because even though they're not doing anything, they are still alive. They're in a state of anhydrobiosis, I think it's called, where basically they are surviving in a suspended state. But inside of there are still metabolic processes going on at a very reduced rate. So, yeah, they do need to actually breathe a little bit. Or at least it's not a bad thing if they do. Okay, and that's the last of those seeds then. And so now all I need to do is just fold over the top like that. Secure that with a paper clip. And so there we go, that's my little packet of volunteer squash seeds. I'll save that in a sort of dark and cool, dry place. And we'll try growing some of those on purpose next time. Now it's worth noting, obviously these might not come true. They might not do the same thing that the parents did, either because the plant that produced this squash got cross-pollinated with something else, or because of genetics, just because this one didn't come true from type. Well, I think this plant grew from the seeds of a butternut squash, even though it didn't look like a butternut squash. I think most likely what happened is I ate an F1 hybrid butternut squash. The seeds that I scooped out of there into the compost survived through, and so my volunteer squash was the offspring of an F1 hybrid, which very often is not like the parent. So who knows what these will do? Maybe they will stabilise and become like that volunteer squash. Maybe they'll do something else. Who knows? It'll be interesting to find out. I was thinking about all of the attempts people have made to make vegetarian or vegan burgers, meat-free burgers, and it just occurred to me that trying to replicate the texture of meat in a burger, it seems like a difficult thing to do. On the other hand, a sloppy joe, which is just kind of loose meat in a sandwich, seems like it might be a lot easier to do a kind of meat-free version of and not have to worry about really trying to make it seem like meat. So we're going to try that today. So the kind of star ingredient today is going to be green lentils. I'm going to put some vegetables in there. I've got my dried mushrooms. These are dried trooping funnel mushrooms. You could use any kind of dried mushrooms. You could probably use fresh mushrooms if you cook them down. And I've also got my mushroom powder, which I made. This is, again, made from wild mushrooms that I foraged. You can buy mushroom powder, or you could use stock cubes or any kind of seasoning. This is really just to give it a little bit of a boost. I probably actually should explain where these mushrooms came from, so let's just cut back to that right now. So we went out for a walk this morning with Doggo, and I took the basket because I was hoping we might find chestnuts. It's the middle of November, and the chestnuts were all finished, but I did find some rather nice mushrooms. So we found a whole load of trooping funnel. We found some rather nice, although quite mature, specimens of hedgehog fungus. So the hedgehog fungus I'm going to have for dinner this evening. I think we'll chop that up and we'll make a kind of mushroom stuffing to go with chicken. The trooping funnels, oh, and we found one little sep as well. Slightly beaten up and worse for wear, but I will scrub that up, trim off the bad bits, and I think we'll put that in the dehydrator. I'm also going to dehydrate these funnels because I have a plan to make some kind of fake meat type of thing out of these. But I need to dry them first, which will intensify the flavour and also firm up the texture. So, going to get this lot in the dehydrator. Now, as always, I'm not going to wash these mushrooms. I'm just going to brush them with a soft brush to get any bits of the forest out of the gills and off the caps. And if they need it, a little wipe with a damp kitchen paper towel to get any bits of dirt off the caps. If you want to wash mushrooms, then go ahead. I personally prefer not to. I just find it ruins them. They're just, especially if they're going to be dehydrated, it's going to prolong the time taken to dehydrate them, and it just makes them slimy and unpleasant to handle, I find, and they don't need washing. So these mushrooms are amazing, and we're going to use every bit of them today, but I'm going to separate the stalks and process those separately. These are ideal for drying because they just tear apart into strips like this. They don't even need to be cut. These mushrooms can be prone to maggot infestation. Trooping funnel is sometimes prone to that. These specimens seem to be really good. Actually, I've been lucky today. And so even the really big ones, whilst they have got some insects on the top of them, they don't appear to have any maggots inside them. Let's have a look, just to confirm that. I'm just going to cut. Yeah, the stalks that are really mature are a little bit on the tough side, but we can just tear them open like this, and we would see in here, basically, if there were maggots, this would all be hollow and would be a network of little holes. It isn't, so I'm quite pleased that we've got good clean mushrooms today. And yeah, just use a brushing sort of with the gills to get any little specks of forest floor material out of there. And that's really all they need. I'm afraid I didn't take the camera with me when I was walking the dog this morning, and so I didn't get any footage of actually picking these, but there is a previous video where I've shown these growing in situ, and then I cooked them, and they were kind of a bit like pulled pork. So you can cook them from fresh, and yeah, if you cook them long enough, they get quite dense and take on a very meaty texture. I'm hoping that I'll do the same kind of thing by dehydrating them first. But they're magnificent mushrooms, and when you find them, you quite often find a lot of them. And that was the case today. So I didn't pick all of what I found, I picked just a basket full. But I did find a big troop of these going right through the woods, and I could have picked 10 baskets probably, but that seems greedy. So that basket of mushrooms has filled up 3 full trays on my dehydrator, and then I've got all these stalk pieces here as well, which I am going to dehydrate. They are more fibrous than the cap material, but that doesn't matter because I'm going to, in theory, grind these up once they are dehydrated. So I'm going to make a powder out of this, which will have lots of flavour, and the texture won't really matter. And then we just got room on the other side over here for that poor little sep, which is a bit of a sad specimen, but it is perfectly sound. This is my test for penny bun mushrooms, is you tap them and they kind of almost ring like a drum. And so this mushroom, after a little bit of cleaning up, I'm just going to slice it onto this side of the dehydrator. Right, so dehydrator is going to go on now for probably 8 hours on about 55 Celsius. Okay, it's the following day, and the dehydrator was run for 8 hours, and then in the morning I ran it for another half hour just to drive off any moisture that might have got back in there overnight when it stopped. And as you can see, a change has taken place. So what I'm going to do now, I've got these lovely, quite crispy little shreds of mushroom, but you can see how much they've shrunk down. So I'm going to unload this all now, and then we'll have a look at what the yield is. And there's the yield. And of course I haven't done this by weight, but that's the cap pieces from the funnel caps, that's the stem pieces, and that's my little porcini. That looks like quite a lot, but of course it's all curly, and a lot of the volume in this bowl is actually empty space. So just think about the size of that basket of mushrooms and the size it's shrunk down to now. But that's good. All we've really driven off is moisture. And the reason for drying these mushrooms is also to condense the aroma. So having a sniff of this mushroom material here now, it's a lot more intense in aroma than it would have been if we just cooked all of those mushrooms. It's not just that it's concentrated, there's something about the drying process that actually develops the aroma of the mushrooms. And so even if you get shop-bought mushrooms, just your ordinary white shop-bought mushrooms, and dehydrate them in a dehydrator, and then rehydrate them and cook them, you get a lot more flavour out of them than you would if you just cooked them directly. So those pieces of stem, or stipe, somebody's bound to have corrected me about that already. I'm going to put into this little coffee and spice grinder, and just give them a little whiz round, see if I can make a kind of mushroom powder. Okay, mushroom dust, don't breathe this. I'm going to sift this just so I can really get it down to a fine powder. And that's working, that looks lovely. I think I'll probably put some porcinis in there as well, just to make a decent batch of mushroom seasoning. So that's the porcinis I picked this time. And I've also got some more here from last year. In fact, this jar of mushrooms from last year, I'm probably going to pulverise all of this down to a powder now, because some of it's already dust at the bottom anyway. And I think that's probably the best way to make sure I use it, is I'm going to powder it down, then I can put it in a little jar in the spice cupboard. And let that settle a bit this time. So there we go, there's, I don't know, probably about half a cup of mushroom powder there. So I'm just going to transfer this to a small jar. And this we can use in any kind of recipe where it just needs a bit of a flavour boost. And it's going to add instant mushroom flavour without really changing the texture of the dish, because it's a fine powder. So this is just going to be like a kind of stock cube type of deal, except obviously with a very significant mushroom flavour and 100% natural. These pieces here I'm just going to put in the storage jar that those other mushrooms came out of. I'm not even going to bother to wash that because it's just dried mushrooms, and washing it is just the way that you end up accidentally introducing moisture back into the dried mushrooms, you know, if you don't completely dry the jar or whatever. So I'm just going to put those in there. So there we go, that's my dried funnel caps. First things first, I'm going to chop up these vegetables and get them frying. So I've got a stick of celery, a carrot, a red pepper and an onion. So what we're going to make is something a bit like mirepoix or sofrito. Just going to dice these into nice uniform small dice. I'm aware that you can leave the root on the onion and dice it that way. I've never really had a problem with just doing it this way, which is just slice it into pieces lengthways and then cut chunks off of that horizontally. I think I probably will peel this just because it's nothing really special. And then I think I'll have probably about half of this red pepper. Okay, and then this lot's just going to go in there, and then I'm just going to gently fry this until it starts to take some colour. Now every time I use this pan and this spatula, I get people telling me I shouldn't use a metal spatula in a non-stick pan. I thought it was fairly obvious this is a plastic spatula. While those vegetables are cooking off over there, I'm just going to take some of these wild mushrooms, quite a lot of these wild mushrooms actually. This is the mushrooms that filled my entire basket. These are trooping funnels, and yeah, they smell really mushroomy. I know that sounds like a statement of the obvious, but it's a really good mushroom for drying. So I've got here, I don't know, a handful of dried mushrooms. That represents probably about half a basket full when they were fresh. They won't rehydrate up to that size though, so we don't need to worry too much about that. I'm just going to chop them up into kind of ground beef sized pieces, if that makes sense. What I'm looking for here in this dish is to create textures. So we're going to have the texture of the lentils, which is great. I like lentils. We're going to have the texture of the vegetables, which are diced into small pieces. Those will be mostly cooked quite soft, but things like the celery do still retain a bit of texture. And then we'll have the meaty chew of these mushrooms, which, even though they're mushrooms, when they're dried and rehydrated, they do have a bit more of a chew to them. So I think that's probably enough of that. So those will go straight into the slow cooker like that. I am going to have to replace this slow cooker soon because the glaze is getting a bit crazed in there, which probably means it's near to the end of its life. I'm also going to put in a teaspoonful of this, probably a rounded teaspoonful of this mushroom powder. Wow, it's really mushroomy. And while we're here, a few other things. So about probably half a teaspoonful of smoked paprika, a whole heaped teaspoonful of sweet paprika, about a teaspoonful of mixed dried herbs, and a teaspoonful of veggie bouillon powder. Could use a stock cube here instead. This is quite good because it's not too salty. It's got a lot of flavour, but it's not too salty, so you can actually add quite a lot of this if you want. And just for a bit more salty and savoury flavour, about probably half a teaspoonful of Marmite yeast extract. It's quite cold here today, so this is like the pitch drop experiment. Now, I always normally just cook lentils straight out the packet into the pan, and it's interesting. I've never really had a problem with that. A lot of people say you should sift them and have a look for stones and things. I've never found anything like that in my lentils, but I'm going to wash the lentils today, and then we'll see what comes off them. We'll see if any sand or grit or mud or something comes off of these lentils. So just going to give them a good stir in cold water. Okay, there's one that seems to want to float. It's just a little husk or something like that. I would probably eat that anyway. And then we'll strain it and see what comes off. Right, so those washed lentils will go straight in the slow cooker. And there's the water from washing the lentils, and I don't know. Somebody told me you will see why you washed them when you wash them. Well, I'm not really seeing why. Like I say, lentils always seem very clean in the packets here. I would say that water's almost clean enough to drink. So I don't really see the point of washing them, but feel free to carry on telling me I should. Okay, these vegetables now have cooked down quite nicely. Some of the moisture is driven off of them, which is good, which concentrates the flavour. And they are just starting to take a little bit of colour on the corners and so on, which is exactly what I want. They are going to get a little bit more cooking than this, while we just have a little bit more oil just right there. Little squeeze of tomato puree, and then a couple of cloves of garlic will go in there as well. I'm going to crush these, so they will not take long to cook. Just going to fry that for a minute to take the harshness off the garlic. All of the vegetables I've put in the slow cooker now from that pan, and I've just deglazed the pan with a little bit of water. No point wasting that flavour. And then last of all, it's just going to be a tin of peeled plum tomatoes. Those are going to provide most of the liquid required for hydrating those mushrooms and lentils, but probably not quite enough. And so just have a bit extra rinse out the can so we don't waste any of that tomato juice. Now those lentils will take up a lot of liquid here, so we can start off reasonably wet, but I think we'll probably stop about there. What I'll do is I'll start off about that much, about that much free liquid. We'll cook that for a bit and we'll see what we end up with. Okay, this has been blipping away all afternoon and it's almost reached the right consistency now. So quite happy with that. The lentils have swelled up. There's still a little bit of liquid there, or else it wouldn't be sloppy. But that's looking pretty good. I'm going to have a little taste now just for seasoning. I think it'll stand a bit more seasoning in there in general, so I'm going to go in with some more Marmite. About another half a teaspoon. I'll just stir that in. I think I'm going to add a little bit of basil to this. Throughout my food-based content during the summer, I've been talking about the Infinite Basil plant. And this is just a kind of conveyor belt process where you take cuttings from one plant, root them in water, and then when they grow roots, you plant them in compost and you have another plant. And so it's a succession thing where it's like a conveyor belt that produces a continuous succession of basil plants. However, something about the Infinite Basil plant has changed, and actually it's become the Finite Basil plant. And let me show you what I mean. So these cuttings I took and placed in water about 2 weeks ago, and they haven't produced roots. And I don't think they're going to. I mean, I'll keep going and keep trying, but there's a tiny bit of root there. But they are very reluctant to produce roots now. And I think what's actually happening here is this plant has realised that we're getting towards the end of the year, and it's trying to produce seeds, because actually we've got flowers here. Now, different plants have different mechanisms by which they sense their own maturity and readiness to flower. Sometimes it's the ambient temperature, sometimes it's the day length, sometimes it's the height of the plant. So they can measure their own height by hormones that flow from the root to the growing point, for example. So I thought basil was working this way, so as long as you kept the plants short, they would carry on growing. So when you take cuttings, you've got another short plant. But it looks like it might be sensitive to temperature or day length, because it's trying to flower. And it's also reluctant to grow vegetatively. But we'll keep on trying, but I suspect we're not going to be able to carry on doing this through the winter. So I might have to start this off again in spring. But in general, the experiment has been a success. We've had I bought one basil plant in the spring, and it's produced a succession of basil plants, and I haven't had to buy any more through the whole of the summer and well into the autumn. Anyway, just got a few leaves off one of those mature plants there. I am just going to chop those up quite roughly and unceremoniously, just into small pieces. It's only going in a casserole, so it doesn't really matter how neat it looks. I'm just going to stir that through, and this probably only needs about another half hour of cooking or something like that, probably, just to bring those flavours together. And then I'll turn it off and I'll let it cool a little bit before we serve it, so that when it goes in the buns, it's not scalding hot. It needs to be just nicely hot and warm, but not so it's going to burn your lips. Okay, right, so here's the theory. Bread roll. These are oven bottom muffins. Sloppy Joe mix. Now, Jenny's going to have this as a kind of vegetarian offering. I'm going to kind of stay plant-based, so I'm not going to have cheese on mine. But I am going to have some of this nice salad. I've got a salad here. I've just, like a coleslaw type of thing. I've dressed it with hummus. And it is spilling off over the sides, but that's kind of par for the course. I shall have a slice of tomato, a good bit of black pepper, and some of my rainbow pickle, which is going to give me a kind of cheesiness anyway, because this is lacto-fermented pickle. So this is going to give me a kind of that funky fermented flavour that you might get from cheese anyway. Okay, so there we go. That's a kind of vegan sloppy Joe. Right, now I don't expect there's going to be a graceful way to eat this, and that's the whole point of the thing, isn't it? It's a sloppy Joe, it's going to be messy. Yeah, I like that. What do you think, Jenny?
Yeah, it's nice. Just messy to eat.
I like having warm and cold. So the cold salad and the warm lentil stew mix in the same mouthful is nice. It is super messy, but of course, you know, knife and fork are here. Anything that falls on the plate, I can scoop up afterwards. Loads and loads of flavour in there from all of those mushrooms, onions, celery, all of the vegetables that went in there. And the lentils themselves are quite tasty. So yeah, there we go. Vegan sloppy joes. Let me know what you think about that. What would you change? What would you substitute? Of course, you might say meat, but you know, there we go. I hope that was interesting. Thanks for watching, and I hope to see you again soon.